Guys and gals, Vlad here with AVT-Astro, and today I've got an interesting topic for you guys. Considering the season that's going on outside, which is around Christmas time, you might have just gotten your first telescope. Ta-da, there it is. So you got your first telescope. You know, it's a really exciting time. I remember about 25 years ago when I got my first scope. I was really excited to get on to use it. You know, now 25 years later, you know, 100 of scopes down the line. And you know, like more accessories than I could count. You know, I was kind of thinking around this Christmas time, what would I like to have known? You know, just getting into the hobby when I was a kid. You know, around 12 years old is when I got my first telescope. So here it is, and let's get into it. All right, so you got your box. You know, let's say you unbox your telescope, right? This is gonna be the quickest unboxing video ever. Boom, there she is. You know, it doesn't really matter what kind of telescope that you get. All of the mechanics, all of the stuff that, you know, the way that it kind of works is more or less the same. You know, this is a fully manual telescope. There's no electronics on it. If you've got an electronic type of telescope, that's great, and it's a very, you know, valuable tool. But it'll, you know, work more or less the same. And you're going to use the same type of things to kind of operate it. So what's the very first tip that I'd give you when you get your telescope, right? What's the very first thing that I do? You know, do not wait for it to be nighttime. The very first thing that you actually want to do is take it out and not point it at the sun. So make sure you're not pointing it at the sun. But what you want to do is, because it's really dangerous, it can't hurt your eye, actually burn out your eye pretty much immediately. The very first thing you want to do when you get your scope, actually, this is a very crucial tip, very helpful, is to align the finder scope, which is this little scope here, to the telescope. And it could be like a little optical finder like this one, which is essentially a mini telescope, or it could be a red dot finder. It doesn't really matter. What you want to do is you want to find something, you know, so point the telescope itself at something with your lowest power eyepiece, which is the highest millimeter setting, at something that's, you know, relatively far away, because that way you'll actually be able to reach focus. So you'll point the telescope, let's say, at like a power pole or whatever is, you know, kind of far away. You'll turn your focuser. This is how you focus the telescope, so get the image sharp looking on the telescope. So you'll find, you know, whatever you can in the telescope first, and then you'll actually use the little adjustment screws to align the finder scope. This is a very, you know, kind of a crucial, seems rudimentary, but crucial tip for your first scope. You know, a successful night out with it is that if you take this thing out in the middle of the night, try to do this step, it's really hard to do. It's just much easier to do it during the day, and then you'll have a much more successful first night. All right, so we got the finder scope aligned. Now you could actually use your finder scope at night, right? When you point this at whatever in the night sky, your telescope will be pointing at the same thing. That's why it's important to do that first step. So you got your, you know, whole system aligned, right? How do you, you know, like how do you find stuff in the night sky? Well, that's the next tip. So I would start with looking at stuff that's really bright and obvious. You know, we're thinking about the moon, the planets. It doesn't really matter how bright of a light polluted sky you live in. You should be able to see the moon, the planets, and some of the brighter stars. So I'd start with those guys. Pretty much anything that you can see with your eye, you know, you point this thing, and the very first thing that's actually one of the most impressive things to look at is at the moon. That's what I'd start out with. Interestingly enough, again, you know, going back 25 years ago, luckily enough for me, the moon was out when I had the scope out for the first time, the first night. So, you know, that's naturally what I pointed out. So yeah, you know, you'll point the scope with the little finder scope at the moon. You know, once you find it in the finder scope, you know, you're looking through, you know, there. You should be able to look through your eyepiece. Again, I'll start with the lowest power eyepiece that you have, which is the highest millimeter one, number-wise. And, you know, just take a look and see what you see. You'll be, you know, pretty surprised, even with a really entry-level scope like this, how good of an image you'll see of the moon. Now, let's say, you know, you take a look at the moon and it's great, or maybe the moon's not out that first night when, you know, when you're getting your scope out. Not a problem. Hopefully some of the planets are, which actually, you know, let's take a little bit of a tangent, and we'll, you know, kind of get into how would you figure out what's actually out in the night sky, right? Well, if you have a tablet, a cell phone, or a smartphone of any sorts, I would actually just recommend getting an app that's called Sky Safari. I'll have a link to everything that I'm talking about in the description, by the way. But anyhow, they have a free version of it. There's paid versions. Even the free version was plenty enough to get you started. So by all means, check that out. It's a really great app. It'll show you what all planets are out, what all everything else is out, really. The other thing is, if you don't have a smartphone or tablet, a website that's really great to figure out kind of what's going on, just in general, like as far as big astronomy type of stuff, it's Sky and Telescope, which is a magazine, also. Um, Also, if you don't have a smartphone or tablet, or if you just prefer books, this is a little star atlas this is actually one of the first ones that I actually initially, got from the library, and then I ended up buying my own. Really cool, it has a general description of, some of the brighter objects, like the constellations. It's got pictures of, some of the brighter stuff. And then the Star Atlas itself, it's got all the Messier objects, some of the brighter NGC objects in there as well. Just kind of a great, pocket type of an atlas. Sometimes I even take it, like even now, years later. Sometimes I'll take this with me, like if I'm going camping or like like on a astronomy type of adventure trip, just because it's so small. I mean, it fits into anywhere. So I'll have a link to this. This is a really good starter, kind of guide to it, which you can see in the night sky. All right, so kind of coming back from the tangent. So let's say you looked at the moon, or maybe the moon's not out. What else could you see? Well, I found out if any of the planets are. Those are really cool to look at. And then you'll do the basically the same thing. You'll find the planet, first through your finder scope, and then you'll look with your lowest power eyepiece. And by the way, I kind of didn't mention the eyepiece is like this thing that goes into the focuser. Your scope usually will come with one, two, or three of these. So yeah, you'll use the lower magnification eyepiece to find the object. For the planets, you probably do want to go up in power to at least around 100x to see, some amount of detail on them. The most impressive planets to really start out with is Jupiter and Saturn. So those are the two that you really want to look for. Saturn is, of course, the one that has the rings. I mean, once you see it through a telescope, that's going to be one of the most memorable sights you'll ever see. I mean, you can't mistake it for anything else. And, that's one of those objects, that you kind of see it. It's just a wow type of a thing, you know what I mean? Which, unfortunately, in astronomy, there isn't too many of them, especially with an intra-telescope. But the Moon, Saturn, and possibly Jupiter definitely are. Jupiter is really cool. You can see definitely the two brighter bands of Jupiter on. If the great red spot happens to be around, when you're looking at the planet, you might be able to see that depending on the scope and depending on the scene. So anyhow, yeah. So start with the lowest power eyepiece. Go up to probably around 100x. And by the way, if you don't know, the way that you find out the magnification of your telescope is you'll take the focal length of the telescope, which you'll want to look in the manual of what that is, or sometimes they'll even say it on the on the front on the lens or something like that, or on a sticker somewhere on it. And then you divide it out by the focal length of the eyepiece, and that'll give you the magnification. All right, so you looked at the moon, you looked at the planets. You're like, hey, like I bought this thing to see cool stuff, like where's all the galaxies, the nebulas, and all that stuff. Now I'm gonna slow you down. We're gonna stop the train a little bit here. If you happen to live in a dark sky, by all means, like even if you have like a really entry level, like this is a 70 millimeter scope, it's about as entry level as you can get. By all means, go look for your galaxies or whatever. You'll probably be able to see them. If you live in the city, if you live in the light polluted city, and you're actually trying to observe from the city, I would honestly recommend you not try to, start out with, trying to find galaxies. Galaxies, unfortunately, get affected by light pollution the most out of any object. Start with some of the brighter stuff like star clusters and planetary nebula. And I'll kind of get into basically, a few of the objects that you could see pretty well, even from a light polluted sky. So firstly, double stars. They're not the most exciting thing, but they're actually really cool. Look up some of the brightest double stars. And basically what a double star is two stars that in most cases they'll be actually orbiting each other in space. A lot of them have a good color contrast, so one might be like blue, the other might be green or red. So they're really cool to see. Light pollution doesn't really affect them, so they're really a really great object to start with. The other really impressive object, and this is actually kind of getting into deep sky type of stuff, is globular clusters. Check out some of the brighter globular clusters, like Mizzer object number 13, and there's a few other ones that are really bright and impressive. So those are another really good object to start with. So after globular clusters, anything that's an open star cluster is really good to see. So check out some of those. After that, probably the next easiest thing to observe is planetary nebulae, and those are actually stars essentially that are either exploded or they release their outer envelope, and we're not going to get into all the scientific stuff and that type of deal. But check out some of those objects. I'll have links in the video description to some of these objects. I don't want to type up a huge thing about it, just because it kind of depends where you are on the planets. But look up the brightest ones. That's the stuff that you want to start with, especially if you're in a light polluted city. And the reason that I mention all that is, I want you guys to be successful, starting out in the hobby. It can be, kind of demoralizing to not see those, Hubble type of images, through your little scope that you just bought, right? Well, you gotta figure, when you buy like a little telescope, and it could be, like this thing, or even like a several $1,000 instrument, it doesn't really matter. You're not gonna get Hubble type of views through it, no matter how much, you're gonna spend, unfortunately. Because, well, if you think about it, that's why they spent like billions of dollars on the Hubble Space Telescope, where now, hopefully this video is actually being made right when the James Webb Telescope is, on its way to L2, but hopefully the James Webb Telescope as well. So yeah, you're probably not going to get images, and you're not going to get those type of images. But you do, the way you gotta have to look at it is, whatever you're looking at through your telescope, do keep in mind, you're looking at light that's, been traveling for, thousands of miles, millions of miles, billions of miles away from you, and you're seeing it with your eye, or, if you progress into astrophotography or EAA with your camera lens. All right, so we kind of went over the basics of how you can get your scope running right. How you point out some stuff. Some of the brighter stuff that I'd recommend looking at. Initially with your scope. So what are some resources past that? I'd highly recommend you check out a website called cloudynights.com. It's actually, a web forum essentially where a bunch of people, kind of share ideas and talk about astronomy type of stuff. So, check that out. It's a great resource. Pretty much any question that you might have has probably been answered there. If it hasn't, or if you can't find, the answers by using the search, you could always post a question on there. So that's a really, really great resource that I, highly recommend checking out, kind of going forward in the hobby. And then finally, the last thing that I would really highly recommend, if you have a local astronomy club, unless you're in a really tiny city, chances are you do, I would highly recommend joining it. It'll have some of the nicest people there that you'll ever meet. Chances are there, a lot of people are highly knowledgeable in the hobby. You could try out, equipment that's, really high end, or just stuff that, just really out there. Or even maybe, you've had your scope for a little bit and you're just ready to take that next step. You don't know where to go. They'll have people there, they'll kind of help you, guide you through that. All right, so if you don't have an astronomy club, or like you can't get an answer on cloudy nights or whatever, if you just prefer like somebody's opinion, feel free to shoot me an email. Don't like a lot of sometimes I get messages on Facebook. Honestly, a lot of times I don't check Facebook all that often, so actually send me an email or leave like a comment in the video below. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have to the best of my knowledge. Again, I've been in the hobby for for quite some time. I've had the privilege of owning some of the best equipment in the world. But really, it comes down to not the equipment. It just comes down to some people are just wired for astronomy, man. Like they just kind of have like a draw to observing stuff in the heavens. That's what's really great about the hobby. Again, if you can join an astronomy club, I highly recommend it. If not, feel free to reach out to me. Check out Cloudy Nights. They'll kind of be like the next step, besides you just taking your first scope out and just observing with it, right? So now, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions, comments, or anything like that, leave them in the thing below. If you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.